Chapter 20, The Beginning of the End. Summer had blended into fall with its usual grace of colors, cold air, and fading sunlight. Jody had taken to getting up at dawn to walk the river path behind the houses. She liked the feel of the crisp air on her face that had given her an uncommon strength of will to deal with what she now knew she had to keep secret, a rape that no one considered a rape. She was trying hard to come to terms with everything that had transpired over the summer. Her poor skills of not being able to protect Audra against an abusive boyfriend who she had considered a good kid, another example of what poor judgment she truly had, and the inappropriate episode in Archer's apartment. She didn't know how else to refer to it. There were times she found herself barely holding on to the fragile existence of balance between conventional right and wrong. Archer had been conveniently absent from their home ever since it had occurred. He made excuses to Doug for reasons why he couldn't play golf or come over for dinners. Even though the regular hockey season had begun, she knew he was only making excuses. She was grateful he had the good sense not to come over, whether they were excuses or not. She didn't know how she'd handle herself once she did have to see him again, so she tried not to think about it. She strolled the path in deep contemplation while a desert of late cascading leaves in butterscotch yellow, lime green, cherry reds, and chocolate browns floated around her. She raised her face to the sky, trying to feel their flavors, enjoying the gift of peace that Mother Nature always gave her. She knew she wouldn't be able to stay out on this particular morning as long as she usually did because it was Halloween. She had promised Dayla and Dougie J she would finish their costumes for trick-or-treating. Before she turned to head home, she took one last gaze up at the blinding whiteness of the sky where the sun was trying to force itself through the ice-encrusted clouds, shielding the oncoming storm like a mask. It made her think Mother Nature wanted to participate in the Halloween festivities, too, with a disguise of winter gloom. Reluctantly, she started walking back to the house. She bent her head and watched her feet crunch the icy frost that had covered the world that morning, hoping the snow would wait until after Halloween to make its appearance. She knew the kids always hated hiding their costumes under heavy winter coats. Dayla was going as the latest movie heroine, and Dougie J had traded being Peter Pan for the Captain Hook costume Doug had bought him from the Disney store in California. Doug thought his son was getting too old to play Peter Pan anymore and needed toughening up. Jody was thankful the day was progressing quietly for a Saturday. It was with sheer willpower she held back the memories that constantly plagued her mind, but for these few hours she was going to let the complicated task of finishing Halloween costumes keep her busy. She sat at the kitchen table where she could see Dougie J out the kitchen window playing on his play set. Doug was in the living room watching hockey. Lexi was in Audra's bedroom doing some sisterly bonding, and Dayla was behind her rummaging through the refrigerator for an afternoon snack. "Mom, can I have an orange soda?" "I suppose so, but first, can you take Dougie J his jacket?" "Can't you just tell him to come in and get it?" "Dayla, if you want me to finish your costume, you'll do as I ask without questioning me. I'm up to my elbows in glitter, and if I move now, it's going to get everywhere. Do you want the belt to go with this thing or not?" "Yes," Dayla said with a pout on her lips. "All right then, take Dougie his jacket. It's right here on the back of the chair." Dayla made a pretense to object by slightly stomping her feet as she went out the door. Jody made an order at her retreating back. "And make sure he puts it on." Dayla walked to the end of the play set, holding Dougie's jacket. "Dougie, Mom wants you to put your jacket on, so come down and get it, or I'm coming up." "I'm not Dougie. I'm Captain Hook." He was inside the little cabin of the play set, steering an imaginary ship. "This is my ship, and you can't come up unless I say so. Dougie J, I mean it. Come down and get your jacket." "No, Captain Hook don't need no jacket." Dougie watched as his sister made a move to climb the ladder with his coat. He backed away and drew the little plastic sword that came with the costume. "Hold, or I'll strike you down." "God, don't poke that thing at me. Come here and get this." Dayla was at the top of the ladder watching her brother swing his sword. "Urgh," Dougie J growled in his best imitation of a pirate. "You're the crocodile that ate my hand." He held up his right arm, his hand inside a cup that sported a plastic hook at the end. He climbed up on the knee wall of the cabin. "You can't get me." He balanced himself on the ledge and scooted over to the support beam. Earlier in the summer, he had discovered that if he climbed up the frame surrounding the little cabin, he could reach the large beam the swings hung from, hoist himself up, and then climb onto the pitched roof of the cabin. There was just enough decorative woodwork that he could get a firm foothold, allowing him to climb to the top. "Dougie J, get down from there," Dayla scolded as she ran to the front of the set. Dougie had braced his feet on both sides of the pitched roof, jumped down as he tried to gain his balance. He pulled the plastic hook from his waistband where he had put it in order to climb up. He put his hand back inside the plastic cup and said in his best pirate voice, "You'll not get my other hand, crocodile." "Dougie, get down or I'm going to tell Mom." Dayla waited a heartbeat. "I mean it." "Oh gosh, you're so mean." "Okay, I'll come down." His mischievous grin did not match the response. "I'll come down, but I'm going to swing down from the branch." "Don't be stupid, Dougie. You can't swing down from the branch." "God, you're so obnoxious." "Can too. Watch." Dougie J bent down and scooted backward until his feet hung over the edge of the roof. Slowly finding his footing, he slid down one of the frame studs. With one arm wrapped around the stud, he gained his footing and started walking across the ridge beam started walking across the ridge beam the swings hung from, like a gymnast on a balance beam. Halfway across, he reached up and hooked the branch that hung over the pitched roof of the cabin with the plastic hook on his hand. Giving a tug, he pulled the branch toward him, preparing to swing to the ground. He took a step forward, putting weight on the branch. Quickly, with very little effort, the hook separated from the handle inside the plastic cup. Dougie J teetered on the beam, trying to regain his balance, but the small amount of morning frost that hadn't melted hampered his footing. He slipped, holding onto the handle of the hook and trying desperately to grab the branch with his other hand. Dayla watched Dougie wobble. Then, like a snowflake falling in slow motion, he slipped off the beam, letting out a little squeak, and fell hard onto the frozen ground. Still holding the handle of the plastic cup in his hand, he lay crumpled at her feet, silent, still. It took Dayla a stunned second to realize what had happened. "Mom!" It was a chilling cry of a child that only a mother can interpret. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Jody jumped up from the kitchen table, fear skimming goosebumps over her flesh as she ran to the back door where she froze. She saw Dayla standing at the base of the playset, crying, looking down at Dougie J's crooked, unconscious form. Chills ran down her body. "He's not moving, Mom. He's not moving." "Doug!" Jody screamed as she ran out the door. "Doug, call an ambulance." They said he sustained an intraaxial hemorrhage resulting from a traumatic brain injury. The doctors worked for hours trying to relieve the pressure on his brain. He died in the ER at 7:52 p.m. The only evidence that any of it affected Jody was the whiteness of her face and the emptiness of her eyes. She listened to the medical jargon, the doctor's sincere apology upon her son's death, saw the nurse pull the sheet over his face, and watched Doug break down. She did not cry. She did not get hysterical. She did not respond to the doctor's questions. As Doug ran to his son's body, draped himself over the hospital bed, and sobbed, Jody stood where she was in the middle of the emergency room, still and unmoving. The doctor stood and eyed at her, wary of her response, until he watched her slowly slide to the floor in a faint. She crumbled into a smooth, flowing puddle to the floor, dissolved the bones from... Sorry, this one's hard. She crumbled into a smooth, flowing puddle to the floor. The bones dissolved in the shock from her body. At the hospital, Jody woke to shouts and crying and people milling around. She was lying on cold white sheets and saw her family in hysterics. She heard the doctor say to her mother, "We gave her a mild sedative. She's had a severe shock and she fainted." When she came to, she started hyperventilating. We thought it best before she passed out again and hurt herself. She heard Doug shouting at the doctor. What do you mean you couldn't relieve the pressure on his brain? Isn't this a hospital? Isn't that what you do? Somewhere in the recesses of her mind, she knew the questions were coming from a hysterical man who didn't know how to handle his grief except to shout and ask questions that couldn't be answered. She saw her daughters gathered in a circle, embracing each other and crying. She watched her sisters try to console her mother and their children. She listened as her father yelled, "What in the hell was he doing standing on top of that damn playset? Who was supposed to be watching him?" Jody lay watching her family, as calm as watching a movie on a screen, and watched everything play out, detached from her emotions. With little recognition, she felt her hand being squeezed. She let her eyes roam down her prone body and saw Tony standing next to her, holding her hand. Jody, thank God. You've been asleep for quite a while, and I was beginning to get worried. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I heard the call for an ambulance over the police radio and came as soon as I could. I'm here for you, whatever you need." Jody watched tears fall down Tony's face, not comprehending why. Jody saw Tony's lips moving, heard her speaking in a sort of mumble in her head, but she couldn't make out their meaning. Her eyes roamed back up and across the room, the noise from everyone making her head pound. It took a moment for her mind to function. Everything was so confusing. She stared at Doug, who continued to question the doctor. Why, she wondered. What was it? It was something important. She could feel it, but what? She stared, perplexed. Slowly, with painful clarity, it tore her soul in two, and she began to scream. She recalled what happened. She screamed and screamed. She thrashed and cried and screamed. The doctor sedated her again. Section 5. The Welcoming Madness. Mothers Are All Slightly Insane by J.D. Salinger. Chapter 21. Douglas Arthur Jr. Once the sedative had worn off, the doctors and nurses stood around her with a needle in hand in case her hysteria began again. Her father approached her with a look that confused her. His eyes were red and swollen. He had been crying, but his voice had the hard edge she was used to. He looked her in the eye and told her she needed to relax, as if the mere authoritativeness in his voice would induce her to calmness. Yet she could see the underlying pain in his eyes. Dougie J's in a better place now, he said. God has taken him home. Home? In a better place? It was the one thing she heard. For a moment her spirit jolted as she thought her father had just told her Dougie J was simply at home. She jumped up from the bed, getting entangled in the sheets, stumbling, but finally shedding them, she started marching across the room, intent on going to her son. By the time she reached the door, everyone had deduced what was happening. Someone stopped her as the automatic doors of the hospital slid open. They gently grabbed her shoulders. She didn't remember who, but it made her angry to have someone stopping her from leaving when she knew Dougie J was at home alone. Hunched and tense, she informed her would-be captor, "Let go of me. I have to get home." Very slowly and softly, the voice behind her head explained, "Jody, Dougie J isn't at your home. That wasn't what your dad meant. He died. Do you understand?" She turned swiftly and looked Tony in the eyes. Tony had let Jody turn around while keeping both hands on her shoulders. "What are you talking about? He's safe at home. Daddy just said so." The incomprehension in Jody's eyes had the doctor taking a step toward her with a worried expression on his face. Tony raised his hand to stop him. "Give her a minute." Jody saw the doctor from the corner of her eye, a strange being in a white coat hovering like an apparition. She then looked at her family standing around staring at her. Everyone's faces were an odd tint of blotchy reds, whites, and pinks, in a kind of strange rash. Her father, Doug, her sisters, her mother, her daughters, her in-laws. She turned her eyes on Doug. "Doug, why is Daddy mentioning God?" The room remained stunned into silence. She looked from face to face, waiting for someone to answer her. "Answer me, damn you," she yelled in uncustomary anger. Tony gave her arm a slight squeeze. She turned and watched Tony's dark eyes shimmer with a look of pity. Jody, honey, he died, remember? How can you just blurt it out like that? How mean can you be? Audra shouted at Tony. I know it seems cruel, but I'm trained that by being straightforward, it leaves less chance of people being confused when someone dies, like your mother is now, Tony explained. Well, I think it's mean. Of course, Mom knows Dougie J is gone. Jody was watching the exchange of words, but comprehension was impossible. Remember? Do I remember what? She had looked around the room, but didn't see the gurney where they had covered his broken little body. Her mother stepped over and took hold of Jody's arm. Jody, she said just above a whisper, you're going to be strong now. The doctor wants to keep you overnight and possibly keep you sedated. But if you can be strong, we can take you home. They can give you something to help you sleep, but at least you'll be with family. Is that okay? Do you want to come home? Jody had watched her mother walk tentatively toward her and take her arm like the very touch of her would cause her pain. She looked down at her mother's trembling fingers as they held onto her bicep, but she couldn't feel it. Her eyes registered the contact, but her mind couldn't understand why the nerves had shut down, as if the whole scene was elusive, unreal, untouchable, senseless. Mama, she pleaded for her mother to tell her things were all right, to clear up the confusion, to tell her Dougie J was okay. But it wasn't what she did. Be strong for me, sweet girl. You have to be strong for the girls. Stay calm and let us take you home. Katie Olson rubbed her daughter's arm as if she was brushing lint from her sleeve, as tears ran down her face like silent rain. Be strong. Everyone was telling her to be strong. Stay calm. Why was everyone so concerned about her being calm? She would stay calm if they would simply let her go home and get Dougie. She was getting impatient with the lot of them for keeping her from leaving. Fine, she thought. If staying calm will have them letting go of me, then I can stay calm. She was determined to do what they asked just so they'd let her go home and get her baby. She just didn't understand why Doug wasn't fighting just as hard to go home as well. Didn't he understand their 6-year-old son was home alone? Why did he leave him home alone anyway? She thought angrily. With the urgent need to get to her child, she strengthened her resolve, pulled her arms from Tony and her mother's fingers, and said to the room with a firm look on her face in a demanding, no-nonsense voice, I have to go home now. I don't think this is a good idea, Tony said. She needs to stay and be watched. I agree, the doctor chimed in. Ignoring them all, Jody walked toward the exit sign of the hospital and stepped into the frigid blackness of the Halloween night without waiting for anyone to follow her. Her family had watched her leave, perplexed at the change in her behavior. Finally, shock had them leap into action. Tony raced after her first. You just leave her be, Mr. Olson said sternly to Tony. She wants to go home, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to take her home so she can be with family. I have to protest this action, the doctor reiterated. There's no telling what she might do when she starts truly comprehending what happened. Right now she's in a state of denial. I think we know what's best for our daughter, Mr. Olson argued. Mr. Olson, please, she thinks Dougie J is at home. What do you think is going to happen when she realizes he isn't, Tony pleaded. Just never you mind. Now everyone gather your kids and let's get Jody and Doug home. Let her get some sleep. Mr. Olson reacted like a general in charge and headed out the door to follow his daughter and drive her home. The others soon followed as they shuffled like a death march to their cars. Audra drove her dad and sisters home as the rest of the family, not knowing what else to do, drove away with pain burning their hearts that they knew would never heal. Pause. The funeral was held in the local Lutheran church. The Warren family arrived in a black town car provided by the funeral home. Jody had been living off Valium in a coma-like stupor for 5 days while her sisters handled the arrangements of where her son would be laid to rest. During the week that followed, moments of lucidity peeked around the corners of Jody's mind to remind her that Dougie J wouldn't be coming home. Then just as quickly, it would duck back into the darkness of welcome denial and disappear into the phantasm of a world she wanted desperately to stay in. Her family had floated around her like cartoon characters, noisy, animated wisps of color that had no real substance. Doug fielded phone calls that came in almost nonstop. Her mother and mother-in-law cooked and reheated food like a country preparing for doomsday. Her daughters walked in and out of her line of vision with such varying degrees of emotion it made her head ache. Her father-in-law stayed in the backyard, hunched against the cold inside his coat. Her sisters gave orders and made plans like drill sergeants. And her dad simply sat in a chair in the corner of the living room, saying nothing at all. Nothing made sense, nothing was real, and yet she waited for Dougie J to walk in the room wearing his favorite Peter Pan costume and telling her he was going in the backyard to let Tinker Bell play with the other fairies. That's where she wanted to be, with the fairies in their carefree world of magic and no heartache. More than once, someone in the family had caught her in the backyard sitting on the frozen ground and staring at the tree that had killed her son, or at least what was left of the tree. The following morning, after the accident, Tony had been woken by the sound of yelling. When she looked out her kitchen window, she had been shocked to see Doug Warren standing in a pair of flannel pajama bottoms, house slippers, and an open robe exposing his bare chest, chopping away at the trunk of the tree with an axe. The temperature was in the mid-teens, but he didn't seem to notice. He just kept yelling, "You killed my son, you killed my son," as he frantically tried to destroy the tree. Tony had grabbed a sweater and ran to the Warrens' backyard just as Jody, who had fallen asleep somewhere inside the house, came running out barefoot in her rumpled clothes. She threw herself against the tree and wrapped her arms around the trunk. Tony heard Doug shouting, "Jody, get away! No, you won't take this tree. Dougie loves this tree. Jody, this tree killed our son. I'm taking it down. Now get away from it. No, you'll break Dougie's heart." Exasperated with her denial of their son's death and feeling she was intentionally prolonging his pain, he stared into her moist eyes and shouted, "God, can't you get it through your head? Dougie is dead." Like a slap across her face, Jody stopped breathing and simply stared at Doug. "What?" she whispered. "Dougie J is dead, damn it, and this tree killed him." Doug's chest was heaving with exertion and his face was strained from grief and anger. No, he's not. He's inside in bed," Jody said calmly. "Jody, get it through that thick skull of yours. He's gone." No, the screaming seemed to fill her head. "You're a liar. Dougie J's asleep, and he'll want to play when he wakes up." The grief had finally consumed Doug. His tone was menacing, like he wanted to punch someone and make them hurt as much as he was hurting. Jody was the closest victim. What he said had Tony stopping in shock as she slowly approached her friends. "You killed Dougie. Maybe it wasn't the tree at all. Maybe it's your fault." "Doug!" Tony intervened forcefully. "Stop it. Stay out of this, Tony. It's none of your business." The hatred in his eyes had her stopping in her tracks. Turning back to Jody, he continued his assault. "If you had been watching him, you could have stopped him from getting on top of the playset." Tony waited as Doug stopped in mid-accusation as he finally heard his own words. He turned from the trunk of the tree and stared, dumbstruck, at the playset. A slight breeze blew the limb of the tree that scraped the upper beam, and Doug looked up. The top part of the little plastic hook Dougie J had been playing with was still hooked over the branch, the toy he had bought Dougie himself. Hanging from the branch his son had tried to swing from, the branch he had been told to trim back for months. The whole scene taunted his culpability. With slow, jerky movements, Tony watched Doug's body visibly slump. He hung his head in dejected misery, being too heavy for his neck to support any longer. Ignoring his wife's raw gasp of pain, he slowly turned around and walked back into the house, dropping the axe in the middle of the yard. Jody slid to the ground with her arm still around the trunk, his accusation stabbing her guilt, making her grief bleed. She slid to the ground, letting the bark scratch her face. Tony ran over to Jody and tried to pick her up off the ground. "Come on, honey, let's get you inside." Jody whimpered like a kicked puppy. "He didn't mean it, Jody. He's just upset. Please, Jody, let me get you inside. You've scratched your face. Let me get you inside and wash it up." Jody hung limp in Tony's arms as she stared at the slammed door Doug had just entered. His words rained down on her head like sharp shards of ice as she whispered, "My fault, my fault, my fault." Tony was able to get Jody to her feet, but listened to Jody's litany of self-incrimination and knew the hard impact Doug's words would have on Jody's fragile emotions. She watched Jody's eyes go from a watery blue to the stare of an empty shell. Jody's behavior gave Tony pause. She'd seen a lot of grief in her job, and she knew people handle death differently, but Jody's grief seemed to go from the center of her heart right to the marrow of her soul. Tony had never seen anyone react to a death like Jody had. In that moment, they had walked into the house after the ride home from the hospital. Jody had gone from the front door directly to Dougie J's room. Without a word or a tear, she lay down on his bed, covered herself with his blanket, and began to sing a lullaby. Her voice had been so strangely sweet, as if she were singing quietly to her sleeping son. It had actually frightened Tony, and the rest of the week had not gotten better. It was after the incident with the tree that Tony stayed by Jody's side for the entire week. She was truly concerned for her friend. For Jody, it was her turning point. With cold-blooded resolution, her mind decided it was time to leave and take with it the frayed ends of her sanity, leisurely, maliciously, gleefully. When the car stopped at the church, Jody stayed in the car. It was one of the days where the pills had overpowered her depression and left her mind swimming in reality. She hated those days, and on this day, this particular day, she did not want reality because this was the day they were going to bury her son. In the deepest part of her being, where sanity teetered like a top, she knew if she thought of them putting Dougie in the ground, her mind would simply stop her heart and she would die. Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing, she reasoned. Sometimes, when she watched the sun sink at the edge of the world like it too were being laid to rest, she wanted to die, to simply lie down with the sun and let the universe fade to black. Tony had stepped up to the car when she hadn't made a move to get out. Opening the car door, Tony reached her hand in. "Jody, honey, you want to get out of the car?" Jody looked over at her friend. She looked so pretty in her gray and black sweater, she thought. The pills let her mind meander through shifts of normalcy and dreams, and it relaxed her. As if she were talking to one of her children, she replied motherly, "Tony, you should come in out of the cold. Come, sit down with me." With gentle authority, Tony went into advocate mode. Jody, let me help you into the church. Your family is waiting for you." Jody looked over at the door of the church where her family stood. "I'm not really up for service today. Do you think the people would want to come over to the house for punch and cookies afterward?" Tony stood bent at the waist, staring at her friend, her hands staying outstretched. Pulling herself from her temporary silence, she responded carefully, "I think the service is going to be nice, and I know your family would like to have you there." Jody noticed her mother wringing her hands and looking in her direction with a worried face. Looking at her like she didn't recognize her own mother, she took a shaky breath of air into her lungs, and the tearful bubbles popped softly inside her eyes as the memory returned and brought her from her stupor. Looking back at Tony, she admitted, "Tony, I can't do this." The tears started flowing down her cheeks in endless streams. Before Tony could react, she was grabbed by the waist from behind and moved aside by Mr. Olson. "Jody, you're holding up the service. You need to walk into the church with the family. You stop this now, you hear? I don't want any tears. You got to be strong for the girls." It was said firmly, but with a hint of compassion. It was as close as her father had ever come to being understanding. He wasn't very good at it. "I know this is hard, but try and take comfort in knowing Dougie J is with God now. And though we can't understand his reasoning, we know we should be grateful Dougie J will no longer feel the pain of this world." Tony looked over at Mr. Olson, eyes wide from the shock of his words. "Mr. Olson, I don't think that's what she really needs to hear right now." Reaching into the car and taking Jody's hand in uncustomary gentleness, he replied to Tony's concern. "We appreciate your help, Miss Cavallo, but as her father, I think I know what's best for her. She needs to be with her family at this time." Keeping hold of Jody's hand, he pulled her out of the car with just enough forcefulness that Jody had to comply. Tony watched as he walked Jody up the steps and into the church, stunned into immobility by his actions. She eventually followed them into the church and stood at the back of the room. A woman Tony had never met came up and said, "I'm sorry for my brother. He means well, but he can come across a little harsh. He's just hurting so much right now, that's all." "It's all right," Tony replied. "I understand. I guess he feels I'm interfering." Perhaps for now it would be best just to keep your distance." "Perhaps. I understand when a grieving family asks for privacy that it's something that needs to be respected." "Just for a little while, dear." "Of course. But I'm letting you know now, as Jody's friend, I'll be checking up on her in the coming weeks, except, of course, when Mr. Olson is around." The woman patted Tony's arm and turned to find her seat. Tony continued to stare, never taking her eyes off the Warren family, studying them as if they were a case study for odd behavior. Jody had sat through the sermon, stiff-backed and dry-eyed. She had crawled inward inside herself to forget the pain and numb herself to the words the minister spoke. He spoke of sorrow, indeterminate sorrow, whose sorrow she didn't know because hers was so deep it was eating a hole through her chest. Sorrow, she pondered. What a strange word. How inadequate a word that is supposed to describe a pain so deep it hurts. Once again her mind wandered. She looked around, marveling at the colors in the stained glass windows and listening to the sniffling of the people. Far away, somewhere in the distance, she felt a slow, sharp pain in some part of her body. It was a physical pain that worked itself slowly through her emotional state. She couldn't focus long enough on it, however, to distinguish between the emotional or the physical pain she was enduring. She looked down from a natural instinct of survival to locate the feeling. She saw it, there in her lap. She was squeezing the fingers of her left hand in a death grip with her right. The tips of her left fingers were white, and the diamond from her wedding band had turned sideways and was digging into the soft, thin flesh of her middle finger. Blood had started to form in the small puncture marks caused by the gem. She looked at her fingers quizzically. She could see the damage she was causing herself, but she couldn't seem to feel it. Interesting, she thought. The thought came unwillingly into her mind. She was brought out of her self-mutilation when the minister asked someone to stand up and pray, and Doug lifted her by her elbow. She stood as she was instructed to do, but she did not bow her head. She could hear people reciting the prayer, the noises coming from their mouths, but the words had no meaning. She was lost in the movement of their lips. How odd that people's lips have to move in order for humans to talk. If she watched close enough, it became hypnotic, and yet it was irritating her senses. "Stop!" her head screamed. "Stop that annoying movement of your faces. Don't you know how ridiculous you look? The silly way your faces contort when you talk. Why don't you stop? You all look so stupid." The minister finished the sermon with, "If anyone would like to come to the gravesite, please follow the procession. We will then say one final prayer for Douglas Arthur Warren, Jr., and let the Lord take this sweet child into the kingdom of heaven to sit by his side." The mention of her son's name and what was going to happen to him brought Jody's head up, snapping to the front of the room like a bullet. The minister's words had finally penetrated her muddled mind. Her eyes started the stressful blinking that had been missing from her personality since her willful dismissal of her rape, and with one quick inhale of breath, she fainted. End of that one. That chapter is very hard for me. It took me several weeks to write, and as you can see, even though it's fictional, still affects me. So, sorry about the intense one of that. I'll see you later. Bye.